Hello. Our story begins in the middle of a pod race across the barren straits of the Tatooine Desert. A minor league race was taking place, and a part of it was an 8.5-year-old Anakin Skywalker. Don't forget the half part. At his age, small things like half a year were important to him, but there were larger focuses despite this. He was using his beautifully crafted pod racer. Instead of carrying colors of blue and yellow, it wore an egregious chrome look, which was blinding to everyone else in the race. Imagine 2 full suns bearing down on you and then reflecting back into your eyes as you tried to pass. It wasn't a polished chrome either, just steel on steel. Anakin had built this racer and he was incredibly proud of it. The racer itself stalled out and he was trailing behind a group of people ahead of him. If he wanted any chance in racing in the Boon to Eve Classic, his skills as a pilot needed to get better. He sped between obstacles as he attempted to keep up with the other racers in the field. They were just too fast for him. He was frustrated, but he was focused. Anakin paced behind everyone as they crossed the finish line. He was disappointed with his inability to pull out a second or third place. He ripped his speeder over to a pit stop where his friends were waiting for him. Kitster and Wald watched their friend pull in and get off his pod racer. The 2 boys congratulated Anakin on getting his racer started. Despite being rightfully upset and frustrated, his friend's joy helped him remember how awesome it was. He could feel the air blasting past his face and his remarkable feeling of actually maneuvering his racer down the field. Anakin and his friends quickly jumped into the conversation about the race he had just participated in. The adults that survived the race weren't as happy. Most of them were banking on this minor league race so they could get their name into an actual race so they could afford to live. It perhaps was one benefit Anakin and Shmi had as slaves at a hovel. They didn't necessarily have to pay to survive. An odd way to look at a disgusting predicament, but having a positive mindset was the only way for them to survive the ordeal. As Anakin and the other 2 boys were chatting about his experience, they heard a commotion from the stands behind them. When they looked up, they saw a man with a large circular hat. He was a Duros, with tubes coming out of his face, and he stood up with quick intensity. There were 2 men bugging him and he told them to back off. The bounty hunter wasn't left alone, so he clobbered one of the men in the throat and shot the other point blank in the eye. The other guy choked on the ground before Bane pulled his blaster around and fired it through the back of his neck. His eyes scanned the 2 individuals that were dead and then the rest of the stands before noticing the 3 children watching him. He turned back to everyone else and asked if anyone else had any intention to start bugging him again. Not a response was heard, so he planted his pistol back into its holster. He stepped down from the stands and looked to Skywalker and asked how he learned to be a pilot. Anakin stumbled over his words, but the answer was no one taught him. Yeah, that made sense. His performance was pretty underwhelming. Anakin made a reactive face as Bane sauntered away from them. Cad was very annoyed, and while he meant what he said to Skywalker, he didn't really care as much as he did to say what he did. In a normal scenario, he wouldn't have commented, but those guys pissed him off by coming at him like that. The bounty hunter loved watching the minor leagues because there were hidden gems that didn't show up in the pros. What Cad especially liked were the erratic players, because in the major leagues, especially pod racing, there were pros that wouldn't do stupid things. But in this particular league, there were racers who would literally kill themselves and a number of other racers because they thought it'd be funny. There was no rhyme or reason for some of their decisions, and it's why Bane loved to watch it. Because the erratic behavior wasn't commonplace in the pros. He had to admit he was surprised to see Anakin in the lineup, but his performance was mediocre at best. He didn't finish last because the people who did died, but he wasn't anywhere near the front either. Cad stormed towards a shuttle and it took him back to town where he waited impatiently. When he got back, he went to a local cantina and got a drink, or 2, or maybe 3. Unbeknownst to him, Anakin, Kitster, and Wald would enter the same establishment in the following hour. The pod racer was returned to the hovel and the kids rushed in so they could pretend to be adults. They were mostly just hanging out and joking around. Because they weren't a bother to the owner of the cantina, he gave them a free shareable and a couple drinks. There were plenty of kids around the area that would steal from him or force customers out by being annoying, so he rewarded kids who didn't act like hooligans. Anakin, Kitster, and Wald were good kids in his mind. These little rewards were extra incentives for them to become long-time customers when they grew up. Regardless, Cad, who was sat at the bar, looked through his hologram. On it were several bounties that were for the taking. He had just returned from a mission to Nimbon, where he assassinated a political figure and delivered their family to a rival from the system of Slaharan. It's why he was on a break at the League event out by the Barren Straits. Cad had a great reputation with the Hutts, so he was scanning through some of their contract work because he typically got first dibs on whatever he wanted. While he was sitting there, he happened to see the same kids from before out of the corner of his eye. He looked over with a very frustrated expression, recognizing them, but noticing they didn't seem to care that he was here. Must have been nothing. But it was a weird coincidence, surely. The reality is, especially now that he had a couple drinks to mellow him out, there was genuine potential for the boy he saw racing the Chrome Racer. He was young, human, and compelling. He didn't finish in the top 5, but that was still pretty remarkable for someone listed as 8 years old. There was value in that kind of skill, and one of the things his mentor, Jango Fett, had told him was to build a crew. Jango flew solo, but he also didn't like having a crew. He proposed that Bane find himself one, especially because he had recently gotten involved with a Sith Lord named Maul on Corellia. After all, that's why he had his oxygen tubes installed. He hated Force users and had no need to allow one of them an upper hand against him. Maul used a Force choke on someone, and it inspired Cad to be wary of these mystical powers. So, he thought about what kind of value an inexpensive pilot would have for him. If he truly wanted to start a crew, then he wouldn't start by purchasing work from already established names. He needed people who could earn their cut, work for him, and then find their own path outwards. Cad understood, as a known name in the bounty hunting game, there were 2 realities. The first being that other hunters would want to have him killed, because his death would further accelerate their careers, especially without his competition. The second being that individuals who could swear loyalty would be willing to serve under him, and as he trained these individuals, they would become future allies. The bounty hunting world wasn't a place for friendships to blossom or fluffy feelings to prosper. It was a galaxy where alliances eclipsed doing something from the kindness of their heart. Bane didn't care about the other kids. He was only interested in the pod racer, because at his age he could be convinced to learn the bounty hunting way. He could be taught, and if he could learn, then he would become a useful asset. Whether or not Skywalker liked Cad didn't matter. He could have an efficient pilot under his wing for the next couple of years, a decade at most. One thing remained especially true though. Cad Bane could not teach this individual, or any individual for that matter, everything. He needed to ensure he remained the top gunslinger in the galaxy, and there was one other individual who was better than him. But Jango was an ally, and there shouldn't be any rivalries to grow between the two of them. Bane picked the cup off the counter and dumped it into his mouth, before slamming it rim down at the same location. The bartender looked at him, and a couple credits were spread out across the bar, as Cad stood up and turned around. Anakin, Kitster, and Wald were still unaware that the Duros man they saw earlier was in the same bar. Cad was a little tipsy, and he flipped his hat over his head as he walked over towards the table. When he reached it, he planted his fist into it, and pointed at Skywalker, asking him if he wanted to be a pilot someday. Anakin looked at the other boys, hoping that this would be their chance to join a professional crew for pod racing. This could be their chance to sign with a racer and become an understudy. Who knows? Maybe he'd be working with Jabba or something like that. And sure, Anakin hated the Hutts, but still, there were silver linings in things, especially this, and especially as a slave. Anakin's chest heaved with excitement as he put his own drink down and nodded. Bane told him to take a walk with him. Anakin refused. He was a Tatooine kid. He had enough street smarts to not just go along with any stranger, especially with one with the skills of this Duro. So, Bane sighed in almost annoyance, telling the kid that he was trying to start a crew, and he was looking for a pilot. Anakin got a little upset, as this was said to him. This wasn't a pod racing crew type of thing, and he didn't want to work with Bane. He told the bounty hunter that his dream was to be a pod racer, not a scum like himself. Cad looked at the children and scoffed, telling him that he was missing out. He noticed that they were slaves earlier in the day. Anakin could have just bought himself some freedom. Despite Cad believing that this gaslighting would work, it actually made Anakin more resentful as he told Cad that he wouldn't be leaving his mother or his friends. Bane shrugged and scoffed under his breath that Anakin was missing out on an opportunity of a lifetime. He stormed out of the cantina and left for his own personal ship. Anakin and the other boys would return to the hovel before sunset and talk about their weird experience inside the bar. It was odd, was it not? They all thought so. But it became a blip in their day, because aside from that, it was an awesome day. Anakin raced his first race with actual racing, and they got to spend the day away from their duties to their owners. The cantina owner was always kind to them, so it didn't really matter. They got what they wanted out of it, and had a day for themselves. Cad Bane, on the other hand, was having a lot less of a fun time. He was trying to enjoy his day when he got jumped at the race. He expected the kid to join him because typically anyone with that type of skill would see their own value, but nope. He was left with a really bland day, and now, without seeing any real positives coming from this day, he abandoned Tatooine. He picked up some mission on Arame, and he would really loathe Anakin for not joining his crew. When he went on the mission, he got the most credits available from any other job on the market at the time, but the mission itself nearly got him killed. It was one of those times when you really need a pilot to escape an unfavorable situation. Cad Bane was not thrilled at all with how everything turned out on this specific mission. So he finished it, returned the head of the perpetrator to Jabba's throne, and left straight for Mos Espa. While Cad Bane knew well enough that there were millions of pilots in the galaxy, people that would work for cheap or even for free, he wanted to work with this kid. Firstly, he didn't think someone of Anakin's stature would be willing to kill him. He was a quote-unquote good kid, and Bane's conversation inside the cantina told him everything he needed to know about the boy. Working with him wouldn't be difficult because he would listen and do what he needed to do. He was not a born killer. Anakin was a nice kid, with a little edge, but he wouldn't try and kill Cad, because Anakin was a survivor. Worry about payments? Not a thing to consider. In Cad's mind, he could purchase this slave, never have to pay a dime more aside from maybe food, and from there he would profit off the cheap labor Anakin had to offer. If he resented Cad for pulling him away from his mother, then so be it. Kids gotta toughen up, because this galaxy didn't give handouts to special pilots. This was Anakin's chance, and one day he would thank him for it. Hopefully, not in his sleep. He tracked down the boy and eventually found Watto's shop. The boy was left out early, and told to go play, because he had cleaned all the racks and was pretty much set to go. Anakin yippied away to the hovel, and once he left, Cad walked into the shop and questioned the Toydarian how much he would sell Anakin for. Watto threw out a number like 10,000. Cad saw exactly what Watto saw, the potential, so of course he wouldn't be willing to give up his slave. Bane came up with a different method to combat his stubbornness. He told Watto that he could spare his life, and he could take his slave for 2,300 max. Watto snarled, telling Cad that he wouldn't dare. Bane pulled his pistol out and planted it right on Watto's fat blue head, and asked him to dare him. How about he double dare him? Watto hesitated and became very fearful, as indicated by the rapid flapping of his wings. Cad pushed Watto into the wall and told him to tell the boy where to meet him on the following shift. If he didn't comply, then he would have his neck slit, and he'd be hung over his shop like a bad omen. Watto scoffed as Bane walked away, tipping his hat lower towards his head, as he slipped out of the shop, dropping a bag of 2,300 credits on the ground as he did. The following morning, Anakin would come to work and get everything going. Though there was something odd going on. There were guards from a local gang staking out the shop. They told Anakin that he was safe, because they were simply guarding the shop. He knew better than to ask any other questions, so he went along and started opening the racks and preparing the interior of the shop for the actual opening of the store. Anakin would also go into the back courtyard where he would turn on a couple of the service droids and put them to work. By the time he returned, Watto was floating in. The Toydarian man told Anakin that there was a commotion the previous night. Just as he started speaking, blasters started ringing out. Watto told Anakin to run, but as Anakin slipped towards the entrance to the courtyard, Cad dropped down the roof and pulled Anakin out of the way, and shoved him against the wall, telling him to stay down. He fired his pistols at the incoming gang members. Watto tried to get out of the way, which he was fortunate enough to do, but his wing was clipped. Cad lobbed a thermal imploder into the room and it ripped through the gang members, leaving them in a terrible rubble. Cad shoved Anakin towards the debris and told him to stay close. They would be in imminent danger. His owner was going to have him killed for racing. Watto was hidden safely behind a counter, but the bag of 2,300 credits was on top of it. They were shredded, but Bane grabbed the scalding hot credits and dumped them into the exterior of his pocket, whatever wasn't melted or destroyed. The moment they abandoned the shop, they were fired upon again. Cad told Anakin where to run. His mother would be safe, but they wouldn't be until they got out of the city. Blaster fire erupted across the streets, as people all too familiar with these sounds ducked in cover or continued doing what they were doing. A couple people eating on the outskirts of a deli or two just watched in amusement. Bane was the perfect shot, and these gang members were wildly unprepared for who they were squaring off against. Cad didn't duck much, but he just poured a steady array of fire down the corridor of the street, and the gang members kept dropping. Eventually, Cad shoved Anakin into a hangar bay and told him to get into the ship and start the engines. Anakin looked at him with confusion, and Cad deepened his voice and got more vocal, telling Anakin that if he wanted to die, he could sit here and watch, or he could get in the damn ship and get the engines on, so that they could leave unscathed. Anakin nodded and rushed off. The expression in his eyes were awestruck and confused. It was his first blaster fight and escape, so Bane couldn't blame him, but it was time all of that changed. He stepped back as more of the gang piled in. They continued getting dropped, not even a chance, and also Bane had pinned them in a trap. It was a small door and it was a one exit, one entrance type of hangar, so they were stuck in a chokehold. He eventually got into the starship and Skywalker shakily lifted off. By the time they were out of the hangar, Cad was behind Anakin with a hand on his seat and telling the boy exactly what to do. The ship pulled out of the city and flew towards the skyline, but they wouldn't be pursued. This little excitement gave Cad the chance to explain everything he needed to Anakin. Flying was a little different than using a pod racer. Same principle, just more going on. Now that Anakin was a bit more understanding of the vessel, they could take a moment to digest everything. The piece of junk Cad flew was no Slave 1, but it did do the job. As they settled over Tatooine in orbit, Anakin took in the sight. It was beautiful and tragic all at once. He had always dreamed of getting off the planet, and now here he was, orbiting it, with his mother still trapped in slavery. Apparently, he needed to include more depth to his wishes. As he looked at the planet beneath them, Cad reintroduced himself and apologized for the unnecessary combat this morning. He didn't mean anything by it. Anakin turned around and asked what it was all about, and why he was the one bailing him out. Bane sighed, and told Anakin that he had just returned from a mission to Aramie, and he was trying out another local cantina, similar to the one where he ran into him at. What Cad learned was that there were some thugs hired by Wada to basically trap Anakin and take him away. It was an elaborate scheme, because slavers would get paid benefits from the Hutts if their slaves were damaged, killed, or stolen. Think of it as insurance with property, and Wada was trying to perform insurance fraud with the Hutts. Cad expressed that they were interested in Skywalker because he was a pilot, and they wanted to adopt him into their gang or something, so it'd be a win-win for both parties. Being that Bane understood how important it was for Anakin to continue being a pilot, he took him out of the situation. For the time being, they'd have to work together so they could get back to Tatooine to free his mother. Anakin got a little worried though. What would happen to his mother? Cad had a response ready, explaining that she'd be safe. The Toydarian had very little interest in her. She would continue to serve, but there wasn't nearly as much profit for her as there was for Anakin. Being that Skywalker was young, he could be developed into a useful asset for these people, which is why the fraud would be so beneficial for Watto. He could probably buy 1 or 2 more slaves off the benefits. Anakin asked why they couldn't go back down this instant and free his mother. Cad told him that the Hutts would have their crews all over the establishment, the hovel, and pretty much wherever Anakin frequented. Watto would have to talk his way out of it, and if he could manage to, then the Hutts would put extra security up around his location and around his slaves, to make sure this type of thing never occurred again. Anakin thought that the situation was a little fishy, because he couldn't tell if Cad was pulling his leg or not. It didn't seem totally viable. Like, why would the Hutts protect someone if they were caught committing fraud? Essentially, Bane explained that if Watto talked his way out of it, then the Hutts would assume that this was an external matter. Therefore, they would protect their assets, because in this system, Watto was a slave owner, and technically a slave himself. Therefore, his value was equatable to any regular slave in the eyes of the Hutts. Anakin balled his fists, and Bane smiled to himself. All this went to say that there was no scam. Bane told the truth to Anakin from a certain point of view. The only difference was the roles were reversed, and there was no fraud, no scam. It was a simple case of making sure Cad got what he wanted while sounding like a hero, and it worked like a charm, because Anakin told Cad that he would do everything he needed to do so that they could save his mother from Watto. Cad patted Anakin on the shoulder and agreed. Bane would have an awkward conversation about how he worked for the Hutts, but until that time came, in a couple weeks, he would focus on piloting, because after all, that's what the boy wanted to do. He was simply taking advantage of the limited brain power of an 8-year-old. Oh look, a shiny thing over here. Don't let that distract you from this very challenging thing over there. That also worked like a charm, because despite the challenge of the situation, Anakin was able to enjoy the actual aspect of being a pilot. Before they left Tatooine space, they'd practice some maneuvers. Some would have Bane impressed, others would have him irritated, and the rest would leave him sick to his stomach. Anakin wanted to go fast, which was a great case, but spinning was a very nauseating trick, especially when it was done repetitively for 4 or 5 minutes. However, their escapade of training over Tatooine ended with the beginning of a new mission. It was actually really pretty simple. It was a pick up and drop off for a pirate lord working on the Narcaga system. They'd fly into Hutt space at the system of Val. Bane would go in, kill who he needed to, and Anakin would be ready for a shaky pickup. But it would work favorably for the duo. Cad was able to get in and out unscathed, and due to Skywalker piloting, they were well away from the pirate's base before the interceptors could catch the bounty hunters. Bane welcomed Anakin to this way of life, something Anakin himself wasn't sure if he wanted to be fond of or not. But right now, in this moment, he was grateful for the excitement, though there was something else. Kitster and Wald would not be freed. Cad was only picking people with potential, not fans of a decent pilot. From now on, the journey would be between infamous bounty hunter Cad Bane and former slave pod racer Anakin Skywalker. By his mid-teens, Anakin was working as a full-time pilot with Cad Bane, but at this current moment he was sneaking away from the crew lead and the other 2 grunts working with them. Anakin was creeping around Mos Espa as a 15-year-old, and he snuck into Watto's home. The young bounty hunter was a trained killer, but more specifically an expert pilot. He slipped in the window of the top floor of Watto's apartment, and found the Toydarian slave owner fast asleep in his bed. Anakin's blood boiled. Hate spilled out of him as he wrapped his hand over Watto's mouth and nose, and sealed both shut. The man woke in terror, squirming rapidly as his life was being taken out of him by a grown version of the slave he had lost. Anakin started wailing on Watto, slamming his fist into his body with each passing hit, until he ripped a dagger from his belt and held it against Watto's face, but doing it in a toying way. He told Watto that the last thing he would ever see in his pathetic life was the face of his former slave. Watto let out grunts and tried to scream for help until the dagger was plunged into him. It didn't stop there. It was again, and again, and again, and again, and again. Anakin couldn't pull himself to stop until he fell backwards in an exhausted state. He quickly cleaned what little of his clothes and skin he could. Luckily, he was wearing a short-sleeved shirt, making it an easy process before dipping out of the abode. Shmi had been kept from ever being freed by Cliegg Lars, because Watto was able to get a cash bonus from the Hutts, and he brought in 3 extra slaves and moved everyone to a new part of town. Anakin followed the trail there and got his mother out, pushing her towards the starport and telling her he didn't have much time to explain anything. She could see remnants of the blood on his skin and clothes, but she couldn't ask questions as they ran through the streets. When they eventually did get to the port, he embraced her with a massive hug, telling her that he loved her with all of his heart, but she needed to go now. Shmi could see the wear and tear on her son's face. He had a scar over his eye, he had a couple bruises on his skin, there was a patch over his collarbone, and his eyes were tired. She had seen the same expression in herself over the years, and told Anakin to stop whatever path he was on. It was tearing him apart, even if he couldn't see it. The worst part is, he knew, but he didn't have time to tell her that. Anakin handed her a ticket, and a handful of credits. He had been saving everything since his first mission with Cad. This was her chance to get her freedom. It was a ticket to the mid-rim world of Mapuzo. It was both a mining world and a farming world. At the current moment, the surface of the planet was gorgeous, arrays of green never seen on Tatooine. He told her that he had seen it, and he knew she would find home and peace there. It was far removed from the huts and it was within Republic territory. He promised her that he would come back for her and find her. Shmi stopped as he pushed her towards the queue which was loading into the vessel. She told Anakin to find his heart, to find his home, and to save himself before he ever came for her. Shmi told him that she loved him and was very appreciative for his kindness and his love, but she cared more about his own health. She held his hand and made him promise that he would choose himself, and he did. In minutes, mother and son would be separated again. This time, for how long, that was also left unknown. It was time to return to his crew, and of course, the leader of the group, Cad Bane. At this point, the crew had grown very little. There was the sharpshooter, the up-and-coming marksman of Conquer Dawn, named Raiko Hardin. Jango Fett actually suggested that Cad bring him into the group, which he did. The last member included had a little bit more of a recognizable name. He was the demolisher from Corellia, named Dengar. The four of them got along well, as the crew should, but Anakin was the youngest, and he was treated like it. This didn't mean he was disrespected, because everyone recognized his importance as their pilot. They just picked on him frequently, and these were mostly jokes. A couple got Anakin to laugh, but that happened very rarely. Anakin himself didn't mind the new members, but they also had to upgrade to a larger ship, which was an ST-70 assault ship. Anakin, despite its slower speed, preferred this vessel, because he could lock the cabin, lay the pilot's seat out, and use it as a bed. It wasn't the most comfortable thing in the galaxy, but it was far better than the former vessel. Anakin, despite not minding the new guys, had a very deep love and hate relationship with Cad Bane. He still believed the story he was told, and that was all fine and dandy in his eyes, but Bane was such a pain to work with. Like some days, he was nice to be around, even somewhat fun, but other times he pissed Anakin the criff off. He would specifically get under your skin to get a rise out of you. But what made it worse is that he didn't even laugh about it. Dengar and Raiko, absolutely. They'd rustle you up and get a good laugh. Which sure, laughing is contagious, but Cad was such a piece of work. And while Anakin hated a lot of who Cad was, if it weren't for him, he wouldn't have all these skills. Anakin professionally traveled the stars. He was a gunslinger. Not as good as Cad at all, but still a gunslinger. He could banter with the best of them, which he usually didn't. And of course, he was one of the names passed around the underworld for being such a great pilot. He knew how to help people with his skills, and he often tried to be a good person, despite his profession as a bounty hunter. The starship Anakin returned to was called Oida's Revenge. It was based off a pirate queen they killed at Rathana, after getting the ship in their possession. Dengar thought it was a trip, and they kept the name because it rolled off the tongue easily. But Anakin was shoved against the wall by Cad upon his return. Bane snarled in Anakin's face and demanded to know where he went. Skywalker wasn't fazed by this. He'd been through this kind of treatment for years, and he was grateful that he hit his growth spurt early, because Cad was looking up at him just a little. It made it kind of funny in his mind. But he told Bane that he was saving his mother because he was tired of waiting around for Cad to do it. Dengar actually liked this move, and Raiko was snoozing with his head at a 90-degree angle, so he didn't care or hear. Anakin looked at Cad dead in the eyes, and told him to let it go. It was over and done with. Cad shoved Anakin back again, and he fought back, but was tossed over Bane's shoulder as he planted his boot on Anakin's neck. He told the boy he had much to learn before he could ever dream of fighting back. Cad lowered himself down and told Anakin that if he wanted to go out and do it, the next time, just say so. They were a crew, no need to be working behind anyone's back. Bane removed his boot and helped Anakin off the ground and told him to get some rest. They had an important heist coming up. Anakin twisted his shoulder and stormed towards the cockpit. When he was out of earshot, Dengar told Cad that he could go easier on the kid. He was doing the right thing for his blood, and Cad snapped Dengar out of it, reminding him that this was a kill or be killed galaxy. Having such a soft spot would get him killed. If it didn't, then he was one lucky bastard. Anakin could resent him for it for now, but it might just save his life someday. Inside the cockpit, Anakin slammed down into the seat and sighed heavily. Why did he have to be stuck here, in this predicament? His mother was right. He hated being here, and he hated what being a bounty hunter did to him. Anakin wasn't directly involved with most bounties, but he watched helpless people from around the galaxy get dragged away from their homes kicking and screaming, and he did nothing to help or stop it. He did help when he could, but he was tired. His brain was screaming for help, and he was looking for an outlet, somewhere to go, but he was trapped. Anakin's identity revolved around this crew, and Oida's revenge. Bane had even said to him when he was 9 or 10 years old that if he ever tried to break free, then he would never find a name for himself. He was very adamant that he could destroy Anakin's life without putting a finger on him. It was basically slavery, but he got a very small percent of the cut, because he was the pilot and/or driver. In the morning, Anakin was awoken and told to pilot the ship, so he listened. The ship lifted off and out of a hangar bay in Mos Espa. They were here doing a job for Jabba and they had finished it. The new mission was even more exciting in Cad's mind. He told Skywalker and the rest of the crew what they were doing, and where they were going. They were traveling deep into the core to take out a personal rival of Jabba's, and they were going to start a divide. Their target location was Cato Neimoidia, at the headquarters of the Trade Federation. As per the report, Gunray was the last in a long line of viceroys of the Trade Federation that continued to screw over the Hutts. It was a long Cold War between trade routes, supplies, racketeering, gambling, and military movements. The Federation had a much larger military than the Hutts, so Jabba couldn't do anything drastic. But at this current point, according to spies, there were tensions between the major businesses in the galaxy. So in Jabba's mind, he could put a hit out on Gunray, with a highly trusted crew, and get them to stoke the flames of a Federation's downfall. Being that tensions were rising within the core as it was, under Palpatine's leadership, it was about time someone did something drastic. With a chance to finally make the Federation atone for their treatment of the Hutt crime family, Jabba was ready to make a move. With everything in place, Oida's revenge darted into hyperspace, towards the core world of Cato Neimoidia. There wasn't much said during their trip through hyperspace. They all knew what they were likely going to face. There was a reason Jabba sent a group of highly skilled bounty hunters into territory like this. It was the same reason they were acting so quickly. This type of opportunity didn't come often, and for the people of the underworld, they had to pick their forbidden fruit as soon as they could, before it went bad. When they arrived, they sailed down through the clouds and over the floating platforms of the cities on the planet. The starship sailed down below a platform and landed on a natural rock formation outside the city. Anakin was joining them for this mission, because Cad believed they would need gunners more than pilots. The Federation had thousands of battle droids, as were displayed at Naboo 5 or 6 years before. Skywalker followed the crew into the main tower of the Federation headquarters. They used a series of tunnels to reach it, and they climbed up through them into a ventilation shaft. Due to the Jedi sneaking around the Lucrehulk during the Naboo crisis, the Trade Federation decided to change their ventilation systems, and it started at their headquarters. So instead of slyly sneaking around, the vents alerted the battle droids within the facility, and the entire building was shut down. As a result, no one inside the vents knew this. All they knew was that they had to get to the top of the building. As they continued to ascend the tower, it slowly became more and more obvious that something had gone awry, and it was very clearly the rise of battle droid movements. With B2 variants inside the facilities, along with numerous B1 types, it was very clear that they had triggered something, and these droids were trailing them. Cad picked up on it first and decided that Reiko would cause a distraction and then go back into the vents, while the other three moved through the corridors on foot. They'd meet Reiko on the 43rd floor, and from there make a heroic escape. Gunray's office was on the 45th, and they were all currently on the 31st. Reiko lobbed an array of detonators, and they exploded, sending various battle droids off in the different locations. Anakin, Cad, and Dengar jumped out into the smoke and fired into each of the 3 directions, before Cad led them forward. Their blasters rang out until they got into the clear. The entire headquarters, as a result, shut down. Halls started to lock, and Newt Gunray, who was avoiding yet another trial with the courts, was protected in his office by destroyer droids. Gunray at the current moment was dealing with his own predicament. Tyrannus of the forming Confederacy wanted a military. He had gained the support of another conglomerate, and was trying to get the Commerce Guild, Techno-Union, Trade Federation, and banking clans to come to an agreement. It's why there was tension between the conglomerates. They had to compromise to make the separatist movement work, but the Federation and Union were especially greedy, creating unnecessary tension for everyone else. Gunray was at the center of the problem, and he recently broke apart a board meeting between these major players, and Tyrannus openly, as another major player in the call responded with some hostility following Gunray's disruption. Several stories below Gunray, 3 bounty hunters were stuck in gridlock. They had ascended a couple flights of stairs, but super battle droids clogged the stairwell. So they were going to use an alternative means to get up to the 45th floor. Blowing up holes in the ceilings, and then climbing was one of those methods. It just became more difficult because they had to actively avoid battle droids as they searched for new holes to blow up. Though this method started to work really well for them, it was just brutal on the upper body. Cad continued to shred through battle droids, with Dengar's heavy rifle doing an insane amount of damage covering him. Anakin was being regulated to finding places to break open in the ceiling, which wasn't nearly as fun. His resentment during this mission was at an all-time high, but he had to get them through the floors and up to the next levels. By the time they got to the 45th floor, a firefight was already taking place. Blaster fire was everywhere, and Reiko was laughing like a maniac somewhere in the smoke. The head of Gunray had been removed, and the battle droids protecting him were going nuts. Like a Wookiee on death sticks, they were destroying everything in sight. Dengar charged in, lobbing his remaining explosives across the chambers, and ducking in the cover as they ripped open battle droids. Cad and Anakin stood side by side, firing their pistols at the hulking droids. With the skirmish dragging on, more enemies entered the fray. Anakin, being the last one in, had to adapt. He slid towards the droids and shanked one of them with his dagger, the one that killed Watto, and used the droid for cover as he fired at the new enemies approaching. Cad, Reiko, and Dengar were on the other side of the room, confirming their kill and packaging up the head of Gunray, so that they could give it to Jabba on his throne. The package would ensure that the head didn't decompose. They looked over the desk they were hiding behind to see Anakin throwing the droids to the side and ducking out of the way as he fired from his back on the ground into the face of a super battle droid towering over him. Dengar got up and moved away from Anakin, firing into the back of the massive weapon. Cad asked Reiko for the escape plan, and he pointed towards the window. 4 extensions were tied into the ceiling, and they'd have to rappel down, going down 2 flights and then getting into a new set and going down from them. Luckily, they should be able to descend without losing cable room. Cad told Reiko to go, as he pushed him towards the window and started firing at the droids surrounding Anakin. He called the kid and told him to get over now, as Anakin watched Reiko with a box jump out of the window. Skywalker scrambled to his feet and rushed over, where Cad pushed him out, and told him that this time he'd be the last one out. Anakin smiled in an appreciative way, before attaching himself to a cable and descending behind Reiko. Dengar and Cad followed out, rappelling down the side of the building and moving diagonally so the droids couldn't directly hit them. Because it took the other 3 so long to get up here, Reiko was able to set up the perfect escape route, before he got tired of being patient and took out Gunray himself. The bounty hunters, when they got around the 5th floor, allowed themselves across the skyline onto an adjacent building, where they ran away from blaster fire that continued to chase them from a different floor. They didn't need to fire back, their mission was complete. Anakin took point as they got themselves down into the city streets. This wasn't a choice, but they ran out of building to run on. Their troubles weren't finished yet. As they ran quickly down the city streets, an AAT tank surprised them by hovering around a corner and unloading a shell into their direction. Reiko was launched from his feet into the window of a shop. Dengar was thrown in the Bane, and Anakin stopped in his tracks to fire back at the tank. Its armor had no issue defending these shots, as it fired another burst. It exploded behind Anakin, nearly killing Dengar and Bane as it missed and clobbered a street lamp. Anakin helped Reiko out of the glass and pushed him forward. Skywalker turned on a heel and ran behind the other bounty hunters. Just as they dipped around another street corner, they found another tank following them. Dengar was out of explosives, so they had to keep going. Anakin called for Reiko to fire down one of their cannons. He listened, tossing the head of Gunray to Cad, who caught it. Anakin turned around and spotted the shot for the enclosing tank. It prepared to fire, but before it did, it detonated and ripped through the support structure of a building next to it and dragged it down on top of another chasing tank. The bounty hunters continued to run away, chased by battle droids and various new troop types for the coming CIS military. The one Gunray didn't want to join, but wanted to take money off of. The hunters quickly entered the gates of Awita's Revenge, and Anakin scrambled up the ladder and lifted off. They weren't done yet, as he sped away from the numerous vulture droids, released from the hidden hangar bay under the city. Anakin sped the ship as fast as he could, calling for Cad to get to the cannons, which he did. The heavy ship flipped on its side as Anakin dipped down into a canyon. The vulture droids slammed into the walls as they pursued. In the bay of the ship, Dengar and Reiko were thrown from side to side, trying to strap themselves in. Anakin tried spinning before lifting out of the canyon upside down. The Vulture droids followed, some crashing into one another, others getting shot out of the sky by Cad Bane. Skywalker shoved a throttle in, and the ship pushed itself through the clouds over the sky, before it dipped down into the clouds themselves. Another wave of vultures, moving at a much faster rate, sped by the cloud where Anakin hid within, before he dipped out of the cloud and followed from above the squad of fighters. His hand smashed the trigger, as did Cad's, as they unloaded everything the Owita's Revenge had on the Vulture droids. They were blasted out of the sky, and Anakin was able to pilot the ship out of the atmosphere and into hyperspace, before Federation frigates could intercept them. A lot had happened in the last day, but this mission, and his message from his mother before she left for ppsw, made Anakin vow to himself that he would change. This mission was ironically one of their better missions. In other words, he was treated like a part of the crew, rather than the getaway driver. But it made him realize how lowly he had been treated. He had longed for an escape. Cad patted him on the shoulder and slapped his hand against Anakin's after they escaped. That's honestly what kept him here for so long, the camaraderie. Every time he wanted to escape, he'd do something that Bane praised him for, like he was his own child. Maybe that's what it was. Anakin longed for some kind of father figure, and his two examples were Cad Bane and Watto, and maybe the cantina owner who used to get him free food. By the time they reached Tatooine, they were praised and paid well, but Jabba was in a very, very good mood. Aside from Gunray becoming a trophy in his throne room, there was an explosion. The death of Nute Gunray triggered a response from the Federation. They had no reason to assume the Hutts would be involved, because Jabba had kept such a low-key demeanor towards everything the Federation did for so long. Hell, the Hutt Council didn't even know their patriarch went ahead with this mission, so they were just as surprised of Nute Gunray's death. But Jabba informed the crew of Owita's Revenge that before they could get comfortable, gamble, and get some drinks, they had a much more profitable mission ahead of them, one that would be the score of the century. Our story continues inside of Owita's Revenge, outside the capital planet of the intergalactic banking clans at Scipio. With only a mere few days since the assassination of Nute Gunray, much had happened. Cad Bane's crew was stationed on a moon of Scipio, watching over the system as fleets mobilized into position. Anakin, Dengar, Reiko, and Cad were all waiting for their moment to strike. They had been in tight communication with the Hutt crime family, waiting for their mark. Jabba sent them to Scipio immediately following their mission to Cato Neimoidia, but they were all directed to wait, because the tensions following Gunray's death was bubbling over into an actual conflict. Tyrannus was trying to save everything from going too far overboard, but it was too late. The Sith plan was falling apart, because of a near-century-long grudge held by Jabba the Hutt, and ironically, no one in the galaxy tied anything back to the Hutts. The chase that occurred within the city, and throughout the skies of Cato Neimoidia, caught the attention of the conglomerates, but no one really cared. It was clear this action came from one of the other intergalactic monopolies. The banking clans were receiving support from various sector authority and defense fleets. Due to their importance in the galactic market, their protection was highly necessary. The Techno Union and Trade Federation were already trading blows over their respective territories across the Mid-Rim, and the Commerce Guild was capitalizing off of what they could. What had become the accepted story, regardless of its factuality or not, was a group of bounty hunters hired by either Sand Hill, Wat Tambor, or Shu Mai killed opposition leader Gunray. There were some other monopoly heads included in this, but it was mostly assumed to have come from Tambor's court. Wat denied these claims, because he never hired anyone to kill Nute Gunray, but he wasn't going to allow the Trade Federation to openly declare war on him. Chancellor Palpatine and Count Dooku respectively tried to publicly call for an end to this conflict, but blood had already been shed, and by the Force these corporations would not be embarrassed. Losing home territory to an opposition conglomerate was not in their cards, and they would fight tooth and nail to maintain their image. This galactic turmoil, which sent markets spiraling out of control, is exactly why the crew of Owita's Revenge were waiting so patiently. They couldn't go in until they added the right amount of fuel to the flames. Maybe the Hutts shouldn't be doing this, but they had reached out to the Black Suns and Pike Syndicate to work together on this operation. It was kept quiet because they all wanted to capitalize off this war. They could slide in where these corporate demagogues left, because the Republic would be so desperate for any sort of control or stability. The Black Suns and Pikes negotiated a deal with Jabba specifically to ensure they could maintain eyes and ears on these competitors. It was because of this deal that the Pike Syndicate was able to inform Jabba, who then informed the Owita crew that Scipio was their target, and killing the entire banking clan council would add the right fuel to the flames. But if not them, then Sand Hill. See, based on reports from operatives from the 3 major criminal syndicates, there were rumors bouncing around that Count Dooku could unite the Commerce Guild and banking clans. Palpatine was working with these corporations to maintain peace, but Dooku was having more public success in this field. This didn't directly affect Palpatine's popularity either, because it was seen out of his control. However, the main focus that the crime families wanted to hone in on was a potential alliance forming between the guild and the clans. If they could stop the conflict from erupting between the two of them, then it would eventually de-escalate the combat between the Union and Federation. With their mark set, the crew left for the surface of Scipio. When they arrived, similarly to how they operated on Cato Demodia, they landed on the outskirts of the main vault. The mission was simple: kill Sand Hill and vanish from the system. Cad Bane had other ideas about this direction, but he didn't communicate anything about it. He was leaving it up to chance if he wanted to truly go that route. If it looked favorable and profitable, then he would make a deal to support himself and of course his crew. The bounty hunters found themselves at Overlook, where they scanned the facility from the outskirts. They were probably a good 12 clicks away from being on the main landing platform. It's why having someone like Reiko Hardeen around was always positive. Reiko was just scoping out territory. Making an accurate shot from here would be very difficult or nearly impossible. What was noticeable to the bounty hunter was the fact that what they saw in orbit was very similar down here on the surface. The Republic had mobilized everything they could to ensure the protection of the banking clans, and leading the operation on Scipio was Palpatine's own friend, Wilhuff Tarkin. He was here on behalf of both Palpatine and the Outland Region Security Force. It was one of the downsides to the Republic not having a standing military. They had to rely on regional support in cases of conflict. With a steady fleet and protection on the planet, their hope was that they could de-escalate any fighting with the other monopolies. The hope being that a quote-unquote Republic fleet being present would deter conflict. Yet, as the 4 bounty hunters were preparing to move towards the main vault, more reports came in from across the galaxy. Minor monopolies, or in other words, not as large as intergalactic ones, were starting to war with each other as well. These warring factions had their own private military forces, most of them being battle droids, and they were all fighting for control over their power in the galaxy. For these corporations, it was a lot more than just ego or imagery. It was the power they had over trade lanes and supply lines, and influence within the government. These smaller corporations were targeting the weaker-looking Federation, because they could gain their own traction with territory belonging to the major player. It was all falling apart, and none of these 4 bounty hunters responsible for it had any clue. Like, they had a little idea, but how big it had gotten since they arrived at Scipio was beyond them. After hours of trekking through the snow, they eventually arrived outside the main facility. The vault was buried deep inside, and the entire building was heavily defended. Reiko spotted a dozen guards protecting the lower entrance. It was clearly used in case of emergency, and these guards were being switched out every 20 to 30 minutes. The fresh rotation clearly meant that there were hundreds of guards operating inside the facility at a time. Cad scanned for another way in, but unlike the Federation headquarters, there wasn't a direct path through ventilation systems into the building, aside from the main entrance, and they didn't want the attention this time around. Anakin tapped Bane on the shoulder and pointed out a squad of men moving about on the outside of the facilities. He suggested that they take them down and use their uniforms to get inside. Look, it would make them weak, but this was an important heist, right? The biggest score they could ever get, yeah? Cad sighed heavily. It was their best shot, considering this was also an assassination, but it would also work in their hands with this plan. They quickly moved down the mountainside to intercept the squad of men on patrol. They killed each of them rapidly and replaced their own outfits with the blue uniforms of the security officers. Cad was fuming because he hated the tiny hats used by these Republic dogs, but Dengar called him cute to piss him off, and it worked. The 4 men moved up the hill and were let into the facility due to having their uniforms ready to go. No one thought anything of it, because they were all appropriately dressed. Now that they were inside, they needed to find Sand Hill and the Council. Cad led the way, but eventually forfeited this role to Anakin, who fit in the most. Aside from a scar here or there, he had the cleanest military-looking face, Dengar, Racco, and Cad filled in behind him. Racco's tattooed face didn't really help with maintaining an inconspicuous look. They maintained a clean and professional look by walking in formation until they got into an elevator that brought them up into the main lobby of the vault. But they weren't the only ones visiting the banking clans. The Jedi and/or the Chancellor dispatched 2 Jedi Knights to assist with the protection of this location. The 2 weren't recognizable by name, but one had dreadlocks and the other one was a Twi'lek. Cad and the apparent Jedi Master locked eyes for a short moment, before each of the bounty hunters scurried away in a professional manner to ensure they didn't entice the Jedi anymore. Without any knowledge of where to go, the 4 were left to walk around nearly aimlessly. As they continued their movements, they darted into a stairwell and ran up it. They were worried, especially Cad, that the 2 Jedi would follow them here. As they were moving up the stairs, they exited and found a number of Muns waiting outside of what appeared to be the vault. Sandhill himself walked up to them and greeted each of the guards, thanking them for getting here so quickly. San had been displaying paranoia since he was contacted by Count Dooku, and the entire situation with the Federation was making him even more anxious, so he had called a unit of guards to visit the vault with him to make sure it was protected. He was unaware that the Jedi had already arrived, so he was preemptively checking the vault because their mission was more important in his eyes, the mission being his protection. The leader of the clans opened the vault and told the guards to rush in quickly, have their weapons at the ready, and make sure the vault was locked down. Anakin nodded and told his squad to fan out. They did, speedily moving into the vault with their weapons drawn. Cad grabbed each of the allies and told them his secondary plan. He wanted to expose the documents of the banking clans, hoping that it would expose credit lines, deposits of trillionaires, and even potentially showing fraudulent accounts. Cad's selfish hope was to expose the entire reserve to the galaxy, take a couple million credits, and retire. Of course, if he could get more, that'd be great, but this could be their way to the promised land. He deposited a chip into each of their hands and told them exactly what to do with it. They were to go to a terminal in each sector of the vault, plug it in, and let it do its work. When it was finished, they would meet at the entrance, gut Sandhill and the rest of the council, and get the hell off of Scipio before something else went down. As they were running through, Cad got to work on the main vault, plugging his device in and hacking what he could to make sure the process was easier. What he didn't realize was his information on the vault was out of date. The banking clans changed their vault setup, so everything flowed through one main terminal. Sure, it could be accessed across a facility, but with what Bane wanted to do, it had to be done through the main terminal, which is where he was. Dengar and Racco clocked this much earlier than Anakin did, leading them to reunite with Cad before the Jedi entered the vault. Sandhill was telling the Jedi about the squad of guards that entered the vault just minutes before they arrived. Master Quinlan Voss told Ayla to remain here and wait for more guards to arrive. He was going in with Sandhill. She nodded her head. Cad and the other 2 kept their eyes open for Anakin, but he wasn't anywhere to be seen. His chip got stuck in the console he plugged into, and he started to panic as any 15-year-old might. When it got unlatched, he started running towards the main gate. Just as he started moving, blaster fire could be heard, with the whooshing of a lightsaber. When he got to the main corridor, he saw a green lightsaber bobbing around and deflecting shots back at the other guards, who were clearly his squad. Cad yelled out, telling Anakin to be careful, as the Jedi had betrayed them. Quinlan stumbled, tripping over Sandhill's dead body. Anakin ducked away. At the same time, the 3 bounty hunters rushed out of the vault and told the massive group of guards that the Jedi had betrayed them. They needed to be arrested. Ayla looked from side to side and shook her head, but the green lightsaber emanating out of the darkness told the squad of guards that Quinlan was the traitor. Ayla tried to stop their pursuit of her master, but as she moved in to block the guards, she noted the other 3 individuals running away, the same ones that her master told her to be wary of before they got here. She was stuck. Did she stop the guards from potentially hurting her master, or did she stop the perpetrators? More blaster fire erupted behind her, as Quinlan continued to defend himself. She turned to help him, hoping that she could bail her master out of the situation. As she prepared to ignite her weapon, she was decked by Anakin, who didn't even see her. The 2 of them fell over, Anakin slamming into an adjacent wall after running into her. He was looking at the other Jedi as he ran down into another corridor of the vault to avoid that Jedi Master. Anakin's eyes moved to Ayla's hip, where her lightsaber was no longer placed. He panicked and rushed out of the way, slipping over himself and escaping out of the vault, catching a glimmer of her lightsaber in her hand as he did. Just as Anakin escaped, he could see his 3 friends waiting for him at the elevator. Bane waved the kid on, telling him to hurry. His blood pumped as he put everything he had into running. Right behind him ran the other Jedi, noticing the other dead Muns outside the vault. Dengar and Racco pulled their blasters and fired in Anakin's direction. He ducked but continued running, putting a hand over his head so he wasn't killed by accident. Cad continued calling out for Anakin, telling him to get here now, and as he reached his other hand out for Bane, he heard a whizzing speed by his head. A blue blur slammed into the back of the elevator, forcing everyone between Ayla and the weapon to fall in one way or another. Anakin looked up and saw the door shut, and from the elevator itself threw a lightsaber back into Ayla's hand. She pointed her weapon at Anakin and told him to explain the situation to her. He smiled. Yeah, about that. He kicked her hand, but it didn't knock the saber from it. Luckily for Anakin, another couple guards were coming down the hallway to save their comrade. He slipped away as she was fired at, but defended herself adequately. Just as Anakin thought he had caught a break, by slipping down into the stairwell, he was trapped again. He made a genuine good time too, but she disarmed the other guards and leapt down the stairwell and beat him to the bottom, which Anakin manually descended. When she landed in front of him, he put his hands up and communicated that she had caught him. Doing what is what she wanted to know. She didn't know what they were doing inside the vault, and she didn't even know that Sandhill was killed, but she asked Anakin to explain everything to him in great detail, because he was in the vault when everything happened, so he told her the truth. He was sent in with a squad to investigate the interior of the vault, because the leader of the banking clans was paranoid. When they went in, they split off, and what he saw was a head of Sandhill, the lightsaber, and the rest of his squad running. She knew something was off with this story, but what it was, she didn't know. So instead of trying to understand, she told Anakin that her master was in real trouble if he was accused of what Anakin said he did. She knew for a fact that Quinlan wouldn't ever do that, and she'd be damned if Anakin and his little buddies got away with doing whatever it was they did. Anakin rolled his eyes and told her that she as a Jedi could act all moral and whatnot, but that was the truth. Her lightsaber raised as she shoved it towards his neck and stopped. The heat was insane, but it caught his attention, as he told her that they could talk this out, and she nodded her head. That's exactly what she planned on doing here. Anakin was left in a weird predicament. He was an opportunist, so he could make the best out of the situation for himself. If he wanted to escape the bounty hunter way of life, then this Jedi warrior was his way out. He could negotiate this as a ticket into a semi-regular lifestyle, or maybe he could even spare his squad from this. Perhaps even the mighty moral Jedi could see the evil of these entities or conglomerates. She told Anakin that her master was in danger, and therefore her order was in danger, especially if they were blamed for the death of Sandhill. Anakin tried playing the whole why should he care about the Jedi business because they didn't care about him shtick, but Ayla didn't honestly want to hear it. After the fact, sure, but right now, not at all. Ayla told Anakin to tell her about the guards she saw now. The heat on his neck was starting to burn, and he tried to get some distance, but what little he got was enough until he told her the new reality. The guards he was serving with were here on behalf of some dude named Dooku. He was the one that she and the Jedi wanted. Ayla called that ridiculous. He was a former Jedi and political idealist. He wouldn't have anything to gain from trying to screw over the banking clans. She removed her lightsaber from his neck, but continued to allow it buzzing by her side. There wasn't a shot in hell that she would trust Anakin for saying that, but for the sake of this mission, she needed the ally. Anakin asked her what he could get out of this, and she promised him that if he could help her clear Quinlan's name, then she would clear his. Anakin seemed hesitant because he wanted his other friends to be cleared as well. She shook her head. If they got lucky, and they escaped, then she would call off any potential pursuit. He thought for a moment and agreed before asking her what he could do to help this process go by any easier because she didn't fully believe the Dooku thing. Well, that was the difficult part. The Jedi needed proof that Quinlan wasn't the one who killed Sandhill, and to prove that, Anakin would need to convince the other guards that the reason the leader of the banking clans was killed was not because of his squad or the Jedi. He could say that it was someone that wasn't specifically his squad, but a squad of rogues came in to assassinate the banking clan leader. If they could prove Quinlan's and therefore Anakin and his squad's innocence, she let him off easy without even a questioning. She could promise that much. He nodded his head, willing to make the best out of this deal. Luckily for him, he was riding pretty well following his previous mission from Kid Nemodia, something his new ally didn't need to know about. She led the two of them up the stairs and out into the hallways, where a dozen or so guards were strewn about, completely unconscious. Anakin pointed at them and said that wouldn't make her case much better, and she looked at him without a hint of amusement. It was supposed to be a joke, but you know, self-defense leads to one thing or another. Anakin chuckled to himself as he followed behind Ayla into the vault. They entered the room, where even more guards were gathered, and on his knees, in front of the vault and a number of Mun bankers and executives, was Quinlan Voss. He looked very annoyed, but when Ayla and Anakin entered, he was confused. Why would the kid come back with her, or even agree to do this? Anakin waved his hands, jumping in front of Ayla, telling everyone that there was a total miscommunication going on here. The traitors that they were worried about weren't the Jedi. A rogue group of assailants ran into the room following him in a squad, and assassinated the counselors and Sandhill. The Jedi Knights were simply reacting by protecting themselves. The Mun executives turned around with disbelief written across their faces. Clearly this was a lie. Anakin tried to continue to convince them, but they seemed unwavering. Ayla watched Quinlan, curious to see if there was a plan in his mind, and he was eagerly waiting to see what she had come up with. As Anakin started to ramble off track, she expressed that she had seen a number of Sector Authority forces trying to rob the banks. She said that those individuals weren't with the man that was with her, expressing that the Sector Authority had lessened their control over their ranks in the years leading up to this incident. The Jedi had been wary of it, which is why they were sent here with the blessing of the Supreme Chancellor. The Jedi weren't exactly supposed to disclose this information, but at this point, she was hoping it would quell the tensions in the room. It actually worked like a charm, but it didn't work because of Anakin and Ayla. It worked because one of the executives had a panic attack. Their entire vault had been raided, with credits dispersed across the galaxy, while also showing off a number of their secretive transactions to favor certain politicians within the Senate. All of their accounts were released to the public, essentially. Cad Bane's plan to hack the vaults was only intended to make himself and his crew rich, which it probably did, but it also meant that millions of documents alongside trillions of credits were also released out into the public. Due to all of this being held within the vault as non-physical money, it was transferred into various accounts. Didn't matter who got it. All that did matter is how it exposed the banking clans as a whole, and the executives were now panicked. Anakin and Ayla stood side by side, as the individuals in the chambers freaked out, and tossed the keys to Quinlan's cufflinks in front of him, as they stormed out of the room, trying and hoping to rectify the situation for the clans. Everything was going so badly and they needed to make this right immediately, before they lost control over Republic credits. While the execs went off to certify their own doom, Quinlan freed himself and confronted one of the bounty hunters he encountered inside the vault. As he rose to his feet and stormed over towards Anakin, Ayla placed herself between her master and Anakin. She said that she promised him freedom without questioning. Quinlan gave her a look, before turning back and telling her to handle the rest of it then. He'd report back to the council about their mission. Ayla turned around and told him that she promised not to question him, but she would ask if there was anything he'd be willing to share. He grinned and told her that he had plenty of information that might catch her eye. She asked what, and he told her that his communication code was the first thing. Sure, charming, but not now, telling him that she could break her promise if he wanted to keep this up. Turns out all those years of being around Dengar and Racco turned Anakin into a bit of a quipster, but he didn't need to aggravate the Jedi. She was here to finish an official mission, and as far as Anakin was concerned, her mission was about to get much more difficult. He told her that in all seriousness, he didn't have anything to say. Their quarrel wasn't with the conglomerates, he was simply here to complete a job. She asked if there was someone within the Corps that hired him, and he shook his head. His finger pointed down, as if to gesture that he came from the Outer Rim, just without saying it. Ayla understood she was from down there, but it also didn't make a whole lot of sense. She told Anakin that she was appreciative for his ability to compromise for the collective betterment of both of them. He smiled and gave her his communication code, expressing that if she needed any more details, then she knew where to reach him. Ayla reluctantly took it, because her only interest in this was what these bounty hunters from the Outer Rim wanted with the head of Sandhill. And just as Anakin started to walk away, she called out, asking him if he had been to Kid Amodia any time recently. He stopped in his tracks and turned around, smiled, and then left. Inside of a cantina on Coruscant, the now 21-year-old Anakin Skywalker sat in silence. He watched the screens in front of him, as the entire bar quietly stood side by side. Another attack in the continuation of the business war had people gasping at who they really were. They were gambling the lives of millions for profit, and while they had been doing that long before the conflict, they were openly parading their march of death across the galaxy. This particular showing was of a destroyed apartment complex on an Outer Rim world. The Techno Union was an unstoppable force, and Wat Tambor took control over the power of their military when Gunray died. The Federation lagged behind, especially when their assets were declassified in the leak from Scipio, the same one Cad Bane caused for his own benefit. Anakin and the crew of Awita's Revenge had spoken since that day. When he left Ayla, he looked for his friends, but they had abandoned the planet. By the time he returned to Tatooine to find them, they had found themselves a new pilot. Anakin never said anything to them and had to return to full-time work so he could actually make some credits for himself. He had apparently received a payment from the Scipio heist, but it wasn't actually placed into his account, because it was under Cad's name. More proof of the slavery that Bane had subjugated him to. Skywalker nowadays wasn't as much of a bounty hunter as he was a smuggler that was more efficient at mercenary work. Anakin was hired for killing people frequently, and with the galaxy devolving into chaos, it allowed him a chance to profit off of the war dogs from Canto Bight. They needed quick and easy hires to take down their rivals, so that's what Anakin did. He still hated the job, but without someone like Bane breathing down his neck all the time, he found some sense of comfort in this line of work. He did vow to himself to find Shmi and go home to her on Mapuzo, but he was still earning his cut before returning to her. Anakin wanted to make sure the two of them could be set free for as long as they needed. More or less, he wanted to give her an early retirement on their reunion. Anakin decided that he would wait out the conflict, but it went on much longer than he anticipated. However, due to this raging war not being the Clone Wars prepared by the Sith, there were some significant changes. The first major one was how Palpatine lost his re-election. The Chancellor was supposed to have 2 terms, and in the middle of his second one, this conflict started. He wasn't able to fix it before the end of his term, and as a result his popularity was at an all-time low. Revisionist history also didn't help his case either, because people blamed Palpatine for the blockade of Naboo, because he was technically Chancellor during the blockade itself. Palpatine was in a very unfavorable predicament, and he couldn't claw himself out of it for the life of him. As a result, he was forced to step down following the election and begin anew, which mostly resulted in him consulting Dooku on how to go forward with this. Sidious wanted to use the CIS to win over the role of Emperor again, and he planned on convincing the Queen of Naboo to allow him to take Amidala's spot as senator so that he could join the Confederacy. But Padme had a much higher popularity than Palpatine at this point. He'd forgotten about Naboo as Chancellor, and most importantly, he allowed Gunray to get away with the murder of thousands during the blockade. They didn't need to follow him anywhere. This relegated the Sith Lord to working in the shadows, but this also didn't grant him the results he was looking for. Sidious needed a military if he wanted to take the Republic back. The new Chancellor worked remarkably well with the conglomerates, and used her influence to convince them to enter some ceasefires. These only lasted between few parties and for a few days or weeks, but it was something. The Chancellor had a lot of ground to cover, and that was exactly why Palpatine was struggling. All the militaries in the galaxy, aside from the clone army, were at the disposal of warring factions. And sure, the clones were elite troopers, but they would only serve him well if they were a part of the Republic military. Otherwise, it would make the Confederacy look incompetent, it would make their army feel forced, and it wouldn't allow the Sith to actually obtain control over the galaxy. The curse of the clone army was the fact that they couldn't be used unless there was a galactic divide, one between governments, not business entities, and therefore, Palpatine was stuck. Dooku, who was a fiercely independent person, was forced to bear the weight of Sidious's tampering. Palpatine wanted to be involved in everything, and while Dooku's track record wasn't great, due to something happening out of his control, he wasn't able to get Sidious to leave him alone. The dynamic between Tyrannus and his master had always been hands-off, because there wasn't a need for Sidious to be in Dooku's business. But now, Palpatine had no business for himself. Naboo rejected him wholeheartedly. No one wanted to or had time to work with him, and therefore, his biggest concern was projected onto Dooku all the time. This led to resentment from Dooku specifically, and because he had his military leaders ready, without a military, he decided it was time to do something erratic. The Sith plan had failed, and with new opportunities on the horizon, it was his chance to take control for himself. After all, Dooku wasn't married to the Sith or to Palpatine. His goals was to restore balance and unity to the galaxy. With the most powerful entities and elites tearing each other apart in a droid war, which was slowly becoming the popularized title of the conflict, Dooku could seize the moment and have Sidious dealt with, so that's what he did. While Sidious was off-world attempting to build rapport with new allies, Tyrannus brought in his own allies for what would have been the Clone Wars. These included Asajj Ventress and General Grievous. He also hired a number of bounty hunters, survivors of the box, something Anakin had accidentally participated in. He was looking for work when he ended up inside of the box with a bunch of others, so he was pretty much forced to join in on this mission to kill Sidious, even though he wasn't a 15-year-old anymore. His flight from Coruscant was long and boring, but he continued to keep an eye on the constantly changing galactic events. He was 21, and he was responsible for the beginning of the conflict that started 6 years beforehand. He never realized how far this would go, but much of it truly had been a Cold War. The Jedi, like his semi-acquaintance Aayla Secura, had been involved in the conflict, but never as generals for a side of the war. They aided in relief work, which Dooku was relatively neglectful of. He didn't care. The Jedi and the Republic were a curse on the galaxy. He wanted both of them gone, but until he could destroy both of them, he needed to get rid of his master. When these various mercenaries arrived at his castle, they were informed of their directive. They'd be killing the former Chancellor. With individuals like Ventress and Grievous around, Anakin believed it'd be a walk in the park. They were just traveling a short distance to accomplish this mission anyways. They'd be dropping off at the system in question and hunt down this monster. Dooku described this mission as a political assassination, meant to end the conflict between the major warring factions, even though that's not what it would do. They didn't really care about this aspect, aside from Grievous and Ventress. To most of these people, they were here for the enormous payout. Dooku promised a huge sum of credits because he knew only a few mercenaries would survive the encounter with his master. What Tyrannus managed to overlook was the constant paranoia his master lived in, especially since losing the role of Chancellor. So when the bounty hunter squad jumped him at Eridu, he was ready. Anakin was a little disappointed that he didn't get to make amends or get revenge on the crew that had abandoned him at Scipio, because he truly hadn't seen them since the incident, but he'd have much larger concerns to worry about on Eridu. Sneaking up on Palpatine wasn't like jumping an elderly old man. Sure, Palpatine looked old on the outside, because he was, but the Sith Lord was maneuverable unlike anything else ever seen. When he realized he was being hunted by Dooku, his lightsabers ignited, and he attacked the incoming mercenaries. Sidious promised each of them a painful death, using his sabers and aggressively attacking everyone nearby. Some individuals were force choked and killed in an instant. Others were sliced through by the sabers. Grievous and Ventress were the only ones who seemingly had a chance of fighting this machine. Their sabers collided across the courtyard of the governmental building they trapped Sidious at. Anakin and the few bounty hunters, not immediately killed, stood back and took pot shots at the Sith Lord, while the two other duelists held their own to the best of their abilities. It was a chaotic array of light, and everyone involved, aside from the highly trained Sith Lord, struggled immensely. Sidious slammed down on Grievous and disarmed him, before doing the same thing to Asajj. He electrocuted several other survivors and launched Anakin and the hunter he was next to into the wall, knocking both of them unconscious. When they woke up, there were echoes of blaster fire. Anakin looked to the other hunter, bloodthirsty for credits he was promised by Tyrannus. Skywalker, on the other hand, watched this bounty hunter next to him rush to his feet and run into combat, where he was cut down almost instantly. Sidious was holding off Ventress as the remains of Grievous were scattered across the courtyard floors. Anakin had enough of this, and got to his feet, running in the opposite direction and abandoning the planet. He was here for one last go at the game, before returning to his mother. This monster put so much fear into him that he refused to remain a bounty hunter or a mercenary or a trained killer. He couldn't do it anymore, because this line of work wasn't for him. He used the ship Dooku lent them and vanished from the system. Sidious didn't even notice Skywalker's departure, because his only focus was revenge, and Anakin was just a face in the crowd. Instead of hyperspace, Anakin contacted Aayla Secura to inform her that the Chancellor was some sort of evil Jedi. He didn't know the terminology, but he knew that this type of thing was something the Jedi were looking for. The two of them had spoken a couple times over the years, but they never actually saw each other. It was Anakin just checking in, testing his luck, and found that he had absolutely none. In a funny way, Aayla was following this trail from Scipio, the one regarding Dooku. Anakin threw a name out into the air, and she believed there was a case for it, because he was honest about pretty much everything else, but she'd been struggling to find any proof. Ayla hadn't taken on a student of her own since becoming a Jedi Knight, because she was dedicated to finding out this case and getting to the bottom of it. She typically didn't respond to messages from Anakin immediately, so she wouldn't hear the Eridu story for another couple weeks. This, in Ayla's mind, wasn't disrespectful. It was simply a different frequency. She contacted Anakin on his communication code from her second device, not her main one. She didn't want Anakin to be able to track her, is all. Not that he would, but you never know. Ayla checked the second frequency every couple weeks to see if new information from the Dooku case was getting anywhere. The weird thing is, despite Anakin throwing the name off the top of his head on a whim, it was still holding up. She would get further along and feel like she had hit a wall, then some evidence would come out. It was just difficult for the Jedi to actually intervene, and it was entirely due to the scandal revolving around her and her master's involvement at Scipio 6 years ago. There was almost public backlash from the Jedi being present, so the corporations threatened the Council, telling them that they'd go extinct if they were ever found meddling around their facilities again. Not all the corporations felt this way, but the biggest ones did, especially the Techno Union. This was also part of the reason that Palpatine was no longer in office. This led to the case being so difficult to crack for Ayla, but she was getting closer and closer to a fuller story. She had been tracking Dooku with her friends Nadar Veb and Kit Fisto. There was some sort of plot surrounding Dooku, and Anakin was right about it, but how right, she didn't know. When Ayla did get the message from Anakin, she responded immediately, and asked to speak to him directly. She'd have to travel from Coruscant to Mapuzo, where she would find Anakin on a homestead that had been abandoned. He hadn't spoken to his mother yet, because he was afraid that she would reject him, especially because it took him so long to abandon the path of bounty hunting. His mind was eating him alive about it, so Ayla's company was very welcomed. Their conversation mostly revolved around what he saw, and he did take a lie detector test. It proved everything she believed about Dooku, but even more about the former Chancellor, because if Dooku was someone working with Palpatine for so long, then he had to have known. Ayla had tracked the two over the course of the past 6 years, because they started meeting publicly a lot. She couldn't give the evidence to the Council because there was no direct proof of something evil going on, but this first-hand account could have the answers she needed to finish off this case. Following their focused conversation about the investigation, Ayla would tell Anakin to go see his mother, because no matter what, she would be glad that he found his way to her. He may have felt like he had failed, but he would never know the truth until he confronted its reality. It was here where he stopped playing the game instilled into him by Dengar, Cad, and Racco. He'd been trying to be the funny, flirty guy, and he stopped over the past few years, but here he realized the importance of this friendship. Anakin greatly appreciated her kindness in exchange for this information, and before Ayla left, she told him that it wasn't in exchange for anything. It was just decent to be a good person. Anakin would watch Ayla and her Jedi shuttle leave Mapuzo, as he took a speeder across the farmlands to a local town, one of the larger ones on the planet. It was busy, like Mos Espa, just without the constant crime. There were obviously sprinkles of it, but nothing like Tatooine. Anakin parked a speeder on the outskirts of the town and spent a couple hours wandering around, when he was found by his mother. She could see that there was change, but it wasn't as great as she hoped it would be. But after another several years of being separated, they embraced, and she brought him into her home. Shmi hadn't fallen for anyone, but she had a nice corner apartment above a store that she worked in as a clerk. It was honest work, and she enjoyed where she lived. It was an older district in the town, and it was much more quiet than most of the other places around the galaxy. She and Anakin would spend day and night catching up, as she watched the transformation of her son before her very eyes. Anakin was tense and on edge the entire time he was present, but he started to mellow out. The look in his eyes wasn't tired and resentful. It was still present, but it was hopeful and filled with courage. He was beginning a new chapter, and Shmi encouraged Anakin to find home here on Mapuzo and start fresh. His ship was on the outskirts of the town, at the abandoned homestead, but he could be a navigator here. She knew how badly he wanted to see the stars, and if he hadn't gotten tired of them, then that would be a great step forward. Anakin considered it, and thought it sounded really pleasant, but there was something else. He realized how much he desired purpose. Part of that purpose came from the fact that he had seen evils far greater than the Hutts, and he wanted them extinguished. It left him yearning for more from himself, but he couldn't describe what that more could be. Outside of Mapuzo, the Jedi were obligated to check out this case from Aayla Secura. She had been working on it for years, and because she wasn't known to hold wild ideas or be rather radical, like the late Master Qui Gon Jinn, they felt obligated to check out her case. What none of the Jedi were aware of were the assassination attempts on Dooku's life that had become really relevant since Anakin reported his findings half a month before. Sidious was attempting to get his revenge against a very sturdy and healthy Dooku. Saber combat would be a nightmare for Palpatine, but if he could weaken Dooku, then it would assure his instant victory. Sidious could, on all accounts, likely win a duel with Dooku, but he preferred to be safe, because it mattered more to him to find victory. As the Jedi were preparing to make their move to Serena to investigate the Dooku case, there were changes on the galactic scale conflict. Aside from no one knowing about the clone armies, the droid forces from each of the respective factions were running low. On a galactic level, of course, the Republic didn't permit this type of conflict, but they also didn't have the forces necessary to stop it. The Chancellor didn't force conscriptions because it would absolutely damage her term, so they elected to just allow the conflict to complete on its own. The Republic military had grown and it was defending itself, but aside from that, this was an all-around droid conflict. It was what made the Separatist movement look even more fragile. Many systems were willing to join Count Dooku, but because the Chancellor allowed these businesses to destroy themselves over competition, especially from the Techno-Union, they favored the Republic. The Confederacy was a threat to ending these concerns, and if the Republic itself would just allow these corporations to deteriorate naturally, then perhaps there was a saving grace for the system. Those who represented the conglomerates within the Senate lost their seating, and bills had already been put in place for the end of the conflict, and blocked from ever being overturned when the Droid War actually ended. It was an assurance to protect the Republic and galactic interests from these businesses. The Techno-Union was the greatest concern, but while these groups were fighting each other, new territory was brought under Republic control, and therefore protected, because none of the combating entities wanted another enemy, like that of the Republic. The Jedi made their move regardless. Dooku was a threat, and they combated him by bringing in some of their best members. This left Sidious in an especially weird predicament, because he made a move against Dooku at the same time. Who knew Tyrannus was so popular? As it turned out, Dooku was the center of the universe as the Jedi Council descended on him to learn more about this dark Jedi seen by the trusted navigator Anakin Skywalker. Yeah, Anakin had to stretch the truth just a little to make Anakin more believable because she trusted what he told her. At the same time as the war between Jedi and Sith were coming to a conclusion on Sereno, Anakin was visited by some old buddies. This was by happenstance, complete coincidence. Cad was stopping in on this planet so he could capture an escaped double-crosser. The individual had screwed over Jabba, and also, yeah, even 6 years after showing off what the banking clans had in their accounts and taking some of their credits, he was still working for Jabba. It was quite jarring for Anakin to see them, because he assumed they abandoned him, when in reality that was never the case. They staked out for a couple days and waited for him to return, but he never showed himself. Reiko wanted to search more arduously, but they couldn't get any closer with the arrival of more Jedi to the vault, so they left. Their contacts within the prison systems never picked up on him, and no one had seen him in the Outer Rim. Anakin nodded. He hadn't been in the Outer Rim except for that one time he was spying on them to see if they had actually abandoned him, which appeared to be the case. But Anakin was also doing work in the core. It was lighter work, and he was trying to make a more honest living. Cad slapped Anakin's back and told him he'd grown all up on him. He stopped him and asked the kid if he wanted to do one more mission with Oida's revenge. Cad had to hire another pilot, but it would be their last chance to get together for another shot at the big times. Anakin asked Bane how he lost all of his money after their hack, and he explained that they never actually received it, all their work, and they had helped more people than themselves. It was a pretty stupid situation, and sure, Cad could be happy about helping random people around the galaxy, but he was scum. He didn't care about those rapscallions. He wanted money for himself and his crew. So all this time, Anakin thought they made it big and hid out on Canto Bight or whatever, when in reality, they were right back to work for Jabba. They did make a shiny penny off the job, thanks in part to Jabba, but that wore out real thin because the value of the credit plummeted with the droid war commencing. Anakin understood. It had been hard, but he told Cad that he would join them. Truthfully, because it was Anakin, they didn't need to make a big deal out of it. Anakin asked why, and they told him that they were going to intercept Wat Tambor's shuttle and blow it out of the sky. Jabba believed that in killing the leaders of the Techno-Union, he and the Hutts could grab more space. The Hutts and the other crime syndicates had a falling out, which kinda led to a miniature civil war in the Outer Rim. Cad and the rest of the crew knew it was dumb, because in doing this mission, it would allow the Republic to find victory and become unmatched. The Union was the biggest threat in the galaxy. Now with Count Dooku of the Fractured Confederacy dead, Anakin tilted his head, and Bane threw his hands up. It didn't matter. Guess the Jedi finished their job or whatever, it just didn't matter. Anakin told Cad that he'd join him for one last shot, because killing Tambor was the right thing to do. Bane wrapped his arm around Anakin's back and told him he'd gone soft on him. What was with that? Anakin laughed a little as they walked side by side towards Oeda's revenge and called up some. Anakin agreed to this mission because it should realistically be a pretty morally positive mission. He was tired of the conflict, because civilians did get hurt for no reason, so he was in. When they got back to the ship, Anakin hugged and dapped up Dengar and Racco, who were both very excited to see him. The new pilot was a younger guy, a bit younger than Anakin, but he wasn't thrilled to see Skywalker. The crew, which wasn't a very sentimental group, felt like they lost a piece of them when Anakin was lost to Scipio. He was their pilot, and they had to replace pilots every other mission. Jango joined them for a little bit, before leaving to raise his son, which he was still doing relatively peacefully on Kamino. Regardless, the Oeda's revenge lifted off, for one last hurrah. Anakin knew he wasn't coming back to them, but he wanted to make the best of this mission. They had their captured individual from Mapuzo in the bay of the ship, tied down. The new pilot was guarding them, and Anakin was in the cockpit with his three brothers. When they exited from hyperspace at Skako Minor, they saw the massive Techno-Union defense fleet. A battle was coming, and Cad instructed Anakin through their waypoints. They were going to hide in the asteroid belt that had clustered up just north of the fleet, and wait for Wat Tambor to leave the flagship. It took maybe 2 hours for him to abandon the ship for the surface. As he did, the incoming joint fleet of minor corporations left hyperspace and engaged the Techno-Union. This would finish off the droid war, and Wat planned on watching his victory from the surface. As his shuttle descended to the surface, guarded by vulture droids, Anakin pressed out of the asteroid belt. Cad and Dengar told Anakin all about the upgrades to the ship before this. He was very excited. They dropped down and chased the shuttle, and once they were noticed on the radar, the vulture droids broke off, as a number of them from the surface were deployed to stop the attackers from killing Tambor. Anakin weaved past the retreating vultures before firing down into the back of the shuttle, which was heavily defended. Skywalker spun the ship around as Racco behind Anakin launched the missiles. They locked on, but they were blown to pieces by flares that pulled them away from the ship. They were in the atmosphere. Oeda's revenge dove down hard, launching itself with immense speed. Anakin fired the blasters on the front of the ship, as Cad activated the underbelly centering, which whipped around and started firing on the approaching vulture droids from behind them. Anakin weaved the ship regardless, as the rest of the crew smiled in enjoyment. This is what they'd been missing. Skywalker slipped the ship around and fired more shots into the back of the shuttle, which busted an engine. As they continued dropping through the skies, the wave of vulture droids approaching them became visible, as Dengar flipped another switch, activating the deflector shields. But the funny thing is, they didn't need them. They never needed them with Anakin. These upgrades were only added because no pilot, aside from Jango, could fly the Oeda's revenge like this. Anakin dipped below the shots and ran the control yoke up and down, side to side. They broke through the cloud cover, and the missiles were launched into the back of Wat Tambor's vessel, detonating it in the skies over the Skako Minor facilities. They weren't finished yet, they had to escape next. Anakin jolted the ship down, forcing G's onto the people inside the ship. This also launched the new pilot in the cargo bay into the wall. Anakin grinned, and spun the ship several times in a row as he pulled her back and dove down towards the following vultures, firing away. He shredded the droid vessels before pulling back and spinning up through the clouds and out of the atmosphere. As they looked to their left, they could see the Techno-Union fleet breaking. It was the beginning of the end, and they leapt into hyperspace, back towards Mapuzo. Before they could get their happy endings, Cad would kill the new pilot, because he freed the prisoner and tried the mutiny, while they were in hyperspace. Dumb idea. Not really bright, but it was an extra incentive for Anakin to join their crew. When they landed on Mapuzo, Dengar informed Jabba that they would return soon, as Cad and Racco asked Anakin if he'd be willing to join their crew again. As they were saying this, a Jedi shuttle landed next to them. Anakin smiled and shook his head. He told them that he'd always be a friend if they needed one, but his loyalties lay elsewhere. He had almost found himself, and he wished to finish that journey first. Cad respected it. He didn't like it, but he respected it. telling the kid he had come to see as a son that he was thankful for all their adventures. A lot of the sentiment from the crew wasn't present before Anakin's disappearance. It wasn't until after they lost him that they realized how much they all respectively adored him. He was a crucial part of their crew, and well, he had a much larger galaxy to chase, one without wars, Jedi or Sith, and without the Hutts. As a former slave, he was picking the right path for himself, and the crew respected it, each giving him big hugs and wishing him well in his journey. They all said goodbye with smiles, and departed from ppsw to Tatooine. Behind Anakin was Aayla Secura and Jedi Master of the Order Mace Windu. He had come here himself to thank Anakin for unraveling a plot for the Jedi. He explained that few of their brothers and sisters survived the fight with the Sith, but they were forever grateful for this information, as it led to the downfall of their ancient rival. He looked at the ship and expressed that perhaps he had been up to something else, and Anakin bluntly, maybe too honestly for his own good, told the Jedi Master that they had just killed Wat Tambor. A wave of relief washed over Mace's face. The stress of the combat for 6 years had been immense. He stepped towards Anakin and held out a medal. The Jedi didn't do this much, but they were always appreciative of individuals who went above and beyond their civic duty. Mace looked over at Aayla, realizing that Anakin was probably a retiring bounty hunter. But you know, if it works, why bother worrying about the ethics? He could act like he didn't see anything, just this time. Mace handed the medal to Anakin, and he looked at it. A golden tint filled his eyes as he scanned a beautiful medallion that held the emblem of the Jedi Order. It was gorgeous, and he told Mace that he wanted his mother to meet them. The two Jedi followed him into town and struck up some small talk, but overall, they never covered the extent of his work with those bounty hunters. Aayla knew that they were Anakin's old squad, but it was good to know that he'd found his own calling in life. Shmi would be overjoyed to know that her son had truly made a difference. The methods, maybe not preferable, which got a good laugh from the two Jedi, but she was honored to see Anakin recognized by the Jedi Order. Mace congratulated the family, and Shmi offered them to stay for dinner, which they would accept. It'd be a beautiful time, and while it would end at the end of the night, it left Anakin with a hopeful outlook on the future. With the droid war over and the Republic taking back its control, greed and corruption started to wither away. The Hutts would never have the control they wanted from the war they started. This dinner with the Jedi wouldn't lead to any extra affairs with the Order. Anakin and Aayla would actually become really good friends, as they helped each other with varying missions. Anakin even watching Aayla take on the training of Ahsoka Tano at one point or another. Aayla would be Anakin's best woman at his wedding, and hell, even Cad, Dengar, and Ratko made an effort to show up, being his best men. Why wouldn't they? Free booze, free food? Duh, it was a bounty hunter's dream. They didn't get too wasted, but it was a hell of a celebration. The resentments Anakin held for the crew had dissipated, and now, here on ppsw, where Anakin found his home, it was where he would remain. He had great friends, an amazing family, and a part in restoring true order to the Force and to the galaxy. And that, my friends, is a pretty wholesome part to our PP story. Wait, hold on. Special thanks to the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Smoobs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Alexandra Reese the Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewu 670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jenny Nguyen, Santa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Mary 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's actually talk about the story. Sith Clone Wars on Saturday. Now that the both parts are over, let's talk about the story. So, first things first, parted stories. If you guys want to see more of them, we'll do more of them, just so I can tell longer stories with you guys. For everyone's sanity, I'll probably do part 1 of 2, part 2 of 2, or however I want to do it, if that makes more sense. Check the title, let me know what you think of that. Otherwise, 2-parted or 3-parted stories will probably be more common. Not every story is going to be a parted story, just because not every story is deserving of the length. But, you know, let me know what you thought. Full movie will probably come out at the end of each month, and that's probably how I'll do things from here on out. But the story itself, tons of fun. I actually really wanted to go into part 2 with the idea that you might see Anakin become a Jedi. I like the idea of telling these chapters, and also let me know what you think about the chapters, because it kind of leaves some ambiguity about how the story's going to go, like, found, lost, the Jedi, the Sith. You know, found is about him being found by Cad Bane, and lost is about him losing himself, and the Jedi is about Aayla Secura, and the Sith is about the Sith as a whole. So, you know, you have this, like, cool thing where you can have a lot of fun with how each of these titles and chapters are perceived, especially for these parted stories. So I like that aspect about doing this as a part of the story. The idea itself with Anakin becoming a bounty hunter in this timeline, I wanted to go a much different route than the previous bounty hunter story we did, and even being raised by Jango. I wanted this one to be a little bit more combative, a little bit more edgy, but also have a bit of wholesome towards it. And it really becomes more wholesome in part 4, and I wanted that to kind of overlap. There's a time gap, there's a war, and I really wanted the galactic events to be drawn out from what Anakin and the crew did on Kid Neimoidia. And it's in the story where it differs from the Jango and the Bounty Hunter story, where it actually makes a really big galactic impact, where Anakin's mission seems small, but it leads to unforeseen events. And I really liked that approach with this specific story. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the story I had here for you guys today. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.